Ryan Cole had always measured his life in kitchens and wood. As a boy, he had learned the rhythm of chopping onions in his father's diner, and as a man he had risen far enough to open his own small restaurant in the city, the kind of place where regulars knew his name, and he could tell by smell when a sauce had reduced perfectly. When the restaurant went through renovation last year, he had salvaged the heavy oak beams that once supported the ceiling, too stubborn to let them be discarded like waste. Those beams, scarred with knife marks and decades of smoke, became the foundation for a porch he built on his home in the suburbs. To anyone else, it was just a porch, a place to sit with coffee in the morning or to drop bags of groceries before unlocking the door. But to Ryan, it was more than wood nailed together. It was memory and pride, a physical reminder of the years he had spent grinding in hot kitchens, of the sweat and the burns and the noise of orders shouted in a rush. When he sat on that porch at night, legs stretched out, he felt not only that he owned his home, but that he had carved out a small space in the world with his bare hands, a place no one could take from him. The neighborhood was not grand, but it was orderly. Lawns trimmed, driveways power-washed, shutters painted in muted colors that seemed chosen to match one another. Ryan had never been one to obsess over conformity, yet he tried to keep his place neat enough. He was a busy man, managing the restaurant, covering double shifts when staff called in sick, paying bills that always seemed larger than they should be. But the porch gave him something solid. His neighbors noticed it too. Some complimented the craftsmanship, running their hands along the thick railing, surprised when Ryan told them he had done all the work himself. A few muttered that the wood looked unusual compared to the uniform vinyl siding of other houses, but he dismissed it. He believed people would eventually appreciate authenticity more than rules written on a piece of paper by strangers. Ryan's contact with the Homeowners Association was minimal. He had paid the dues they demanded, though always with irritation, because he never saw the promised benefits. A newsletter, now and then, a stern notice about trash bins left out overnight, and the occasional reminder about speed limits inside the community. That was the extent of their presence in his life. He never attended the meetings. His work kept him in the restaurant late, and truthfully, he disliked committees. The porch was his committee, his board of directors, his parliament. He trusted the wood more than bureaucrats with clipboards. In the evenings, after closing the restaurant, he would bring home leftovers, sit on the porch with a plate balanced on his knees, and let the night air wash over him. Sometimes neighbors waved, sometimes kids on bikes sped past shouting, but often it was just quiet, the kind of quiet that makes a man think about what he has built and what it cost. There were days when he thought about expanding the restaurant, opening a second location, maybe even hiring a manager so he could breathe a little. Yet whenever he looked at the porch, he knew he was not chasing an empire. He wanted permanence, not endless growth. The porch was his anchor. His father used to say that in America a man's house was the only castle he could truly defend, and Ryan believed that. He had gone through too much in the food industry, where landlords raised rent without warning and competitors stole staff overnight to take his home for granted. The porch reminded him that some things could not be repossessed or bargained away. It was oak, solid and scarred, and in the grain of the wood he saw years of his life preserved. That was why, on the last quiet morning before everything collapsed, Ryan sat there longer than usual. He stirred sugar into his coffee and rested the mug on the railing, watching the sun climb over the identical rooftops, telling himself he had done something right, something honest, something no one could erase. It never occurred to him that the very people entrusted to protect the community would soon swing a sledgehammer through his memories and call it regulation. It happened on a Tuesday morning that had begun with the same kind of calm routine Ryan always craved before heading to the restaurant, and if he had not been awake early to prepare a delivery order, he might not have witnessed it at all. But instead, he stepped out onto his porch with a steaming mug in one hand and a set of invoices in the other, and the first thing he saw was a group of 4 men in orange vests carrying sledgehammers up his walkway as if they had been invited. At first, he thought they were contractors who had made a mistake, perhaps meant for another address. Yet the way they moved, brisk and confident, told him this was no mistake. He called out, demanding to know what they were doing, and the one in front barely slowed his stride before replying in a clipped tone that they were there under instruction from the Homeowners Association to remove a non-compliant structure. Ryan laughed in disbelief because the structure was the porch beneath his feet, and there was nothing non-compliant about it. He had built it according to code, used reclaimed materials legally purchased, and had no outstanding violations. Before he could say more, the men had reached the steps and begun swinging. The sound was shocking, violent, a deep crack of oak splintering under iron. Ryan rushed down, placing himself between the men and the railing, shouting that they needed to stop, to show paperwork, to present some kind of order. The leader, a tall man with graying hair and a scar across his cheek, barely met his eye before saying flatly that there was no time for arguments. The decision had been made at board level, and any complaints could be filed later. Ryan asked who had authorized it, and the man responded with a single name: Mercer, Diane Mercer, the HOA president. At that moment, one of the others muttered, perhaps too loudly, that "It doesn't matter anyway, the parcel's already spoken for." Ryan caught those words and felt his stomach twist, because they did not sound like language about compliance or safety. They sounded like someone already considered his home property that could be moved around like a chess piece. He tried to block their swings, grabbing one man's sledgehammer by the handle, but the worker yanked it back with such force that Ryan stumbled, and when he regained his footing he saw 2 balusters already broken, the porch bleeding wood chips into the air. He yelled that he was calling the police, but the foreman only shrugged, saying that if Ryan interfered he might be charged for obstruction. It was the casual certainty in his voice that chilled Ryan, because it meant they knew the police would not come rushing to defend him, that the association had calculated the risk and concluded there would be none. In desperation, he pulled out his phone, not to film. He despised the idea of holding up a camera while his life was being destroyed, but to dial 911. The dispatcher listened, asked if the men were threatening him physically, and when Ryan explained they were demolishing his porch under order of the HOA, the dispatcher sighed and told him it sounded like a civil matter. That was the moment Ryan realized no immediate help was coming. He stood there, powerless as they smashed through what had taken him weeks to build, the thick oak beams cracking apart as if they were nothing, the railing that had once felt so solid reduced to jagged fragments. Neighbors began to gather at the edges of their lawns, some pretending to water flowers, others openly staring. No one intervened. A few whispered to one another. Ryan caught sight of Mrs. Jameson from across the street shaking her head and mouthing the word, "Sorry," but she did not step closer. In their eyes he saw not only pity but also fear. The kind of fear that comes from knowing that if they oppose the association today, tomorrow their own fences, sheds, or gardens might be next. When the workers finally stepped back, sweat on their brows, the porch was reduced to rubble piled against the front of his house, broken boards and twisted nails jutting upward like accusations. The leader dropped a folded piece of paper onto the remains. A notice printed with official letterhead declaring the porch unsafe and ordering immediate removal, though the words were useless now because the demolition had already been carried out. Ryan picked it up with trembling hands and saw no signature from an inspector, only the HOA seal and Mercer's typed name. He shouted after them as they walked back to their truck, demanding to know how this could be legal, and the foreman turned once more, giving a half-smile that carried no humor, only fatigue, and said, "File a complaint if you want, but it won't change the outcome." Then they drove off, leaving Ryan standing in the wreckage. He stared at the ruin until the sun rose higher and the heat began to settle on his neck, and still he could not move, because he knew in his bones that this was not about a violation, not about safety, not even about rules. The slip of the tongue, already spoken for, echoed in his mind. Someone wanted his land, and the association had just fired the opening shot of whatever plan was unfolding. The oak beams, once so strong, lay cracked and lifeless at his feet, and he realized with a clarity that chilled him that what had been destroyed was not only a porch, but his belief that his home could not be touched. Ryan did not return to the restaurant that day, though he had a full prep list waiting and a delivery scheduled for the evening, because something inside him told him that if he walked away from the wreckage now, he would never be able to face it again. And so he spent the morning pacing across the splintered remains of his porch, running his hands over the jagged edges of beams that had once been whole, as if by touching the destruction he could force his mind to accept that it was real. Every few minutes he bent down to collect nails or shards of wood, piling them carefully to one side as though he were performing some ritual. But the truth was, he was trying to keep himself from falling apart. By noon, he decided he could not simply stand in silence while strangers stripped him of what was his. So he drove across town to the nondescript strip mall where the HOA kept its office, a space sandwiched between a tanning salon and an insurance agency, with a glass door that reflected the sun so harshly he had to shield his eyes. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee, and behind a laminate desk sat a receptionist who did not bother to hide her annoyance when Ryan demanded to speak to the president. She asked if he had an appointment, and when he said no, she tapped her keyboard without looking at him and muttered that Mrs. Mercer was busy. He leaned across the counter, lowering his voice, telling her that his porch had been demolished that morning on Mercer's order, that he had a right to speak directly to whoever had signed that decision, and, after a long sigh, she disappeared into the back. Several minutes later, the door opened and Diane Mercer herself appeared, dressed in a pale blue suit that looked more suited to a courtroom than a community office, her hair pinned so tightly it seemed immovable. She greeted him with a smile so polite it bordered on mockery and gestured toward a small conference room, inviting him to sit. Ryan refused the chair, remaining standing as he demanded an explanation. Mercer listened with her hands folded neatly on the table, nodding occasionally as though he were recounting a trivial complaint about lawn height rather than the destruction of his property. When he finished, she opened a folder and slid a single sheet of paper toward him, a notice dated 2 weeks earlier claiming his porch had been declared unsafe and requiring removal. Ryan stared at it in disbelief because he had never received it, and when he pointed this out, Mercer shrugged and said that notices were mailed to the address on file, and if he had failed to check his mailbox, that was hardly the association's fault. He told her the porch was sound, built from beams stronger than most of the cheap lumber used in the neighborhood, and demanded to know why no inspector had ever visited. Mercer's tone cooled as she explained that the board had authority to act in the interest of community safety without waiting for city inspectors, and in this case they had deemed his structure both unsafe and non-compliant with community aesthetics. Ryan slammed his hand on the table, saying that aesthetics were not law, that she had no right to decide whether wood looked appropriate, but Mercer remained calm, repeating that the board had acted within its rights. Then she added something that froze him. She said that if he wished to avoid further conflict, perhaps he should consider negotiating a sale of the property, as certain redevelopment opportunities were on the horizon that could benefit the entire neighborhood. Ryan demanded to know what she meant, but she only gave that same thin smile and said he would hear more in due time. As he left the office, he passed 2 men in suits carrying rolls of blueprints, their voices low, one of them saying something about clearing parcels before the end of the quarter. Ryan slowed, pretending to adjust his jacket, catching just enough of their conversation to confirm what he had begun to suspect. The demolition of his porch was not an isolated action, but part of a larger plan to make his property, and likely others, more vulnerable to acquisition. He felt a wave of anger so strong he nearly turned back to confront Mercer again, but something about the self-assured way she had dismissed him told him it would be useless. Driving home, Ryan's mind spun with questions, and when he arrived he found a fresh envelope taped to his front door. It was another notice from the HOA, this one citing him for debris left in his yard, ordering removal within 48 hours or risk additional fines. He laughed bitterly at the absurdity. They had demolished his porch and now fined him for the rubble they had created. He crumpled the notice and tossed it onto the pile of broken boards, his anger no longer sharp but heavy, settling in his chest like stone. That night, he could not sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he heard the crack of oak under steel, saw the indifference in Mercer's expression, heard again the words, "already spoken for." He rose before dawn and sat in his car with the engine idling, staring at the empty space, where his porch had once stood, and he made himself a promise that he would not allow them to erase him quietly. He did not yet know how he would fight, but he knew that if he failed to act, he would be complicit in his own erasure, and that thought was more unbearable than the wreckage before him. 2 days passed with Ryan caught between exhaustion and fury, the restaurant running on autopilot with his sous chef covering while he devoted himself to a cause he could not yet define. And though he told himself that he was gathering information, he knew he was also buying time, delaying the moment when the association would strike again. On the third evening, as the sky turned the color of bruised peaches and the wreckage of his porch glowed faintly in the low light, he noticed a dark SUV idling at the end of the block. At first he thought it belonged to a neighbor's visitor, but it remained there for nearly an hour, headlights off, and when he finally walked toward it, phone in hand, the vehicle pulled away without a sound. That was when he realized that Mercer's hints about redevelopment were not idle threats but steps in a process already underway. He returned inside and spread every piece of correspondence he had ever received from the HOA across his dining table, a chaotic collage of warning letters, newsletters, and annual fee invoices. He read them not for content but for pattern, searching for discrepancies, and his eyes caught on one subtle but damning detail. The return address printed on the recent demolition notice was not the same as the one used in older letters. He followed that thread the next morning, driving not to the strip mall office but to the address printed on the notice, which turned out to be a converted warehouse near the industrial district. The building bore no signage, only a keypad and tinted windows, but as he sat in his car watching, a delivery truck arrived, and workers carried in boxes marked with the name of a real estate development firm he recognized from a newspaper article about an upcoming luxury project across town. He felt the air thicken around him, the sense that his suspicion was now solid. The HOA had become a front, whether willingly or through corruption, for a developer's land grab. That evening, Ryan decided he could no longer act alone, though he despised the idea of appearing vulnerable. So he reached out to a man he had once cooked beside years ago, Luis Ortega, who had left the kitchen world to become a paralegal. They met in the back corner of a diner, and Ryan poured out the story in one long rush. The demolition, the altered addresses, the hints about redevelopment. Luis listened with the patience of someone used to unraveling chaos, then told him that what Ryan described sounded like a common tactic in shady property acquisitions: manufacture violations, create pressure, insert fraudulent paperwork into official channels, and by the time the homeowner realized, the deed would already be clouded. Luis offered to check county records. 2 days later, he called with news that left Ryan cold. According to the county's online database, the title of his house had been updated to include not only his name but a second one, Edward Carson, listed as co-owner. Ryan nearly dropped the phone. He had never heard the name before, never signed any document that would allow such a transfer, yet there it was, sitting in an official system. Worse still, a lien had been filed against the property, citing unpaid association fees that Ryan knew he had already paid, complete with late penalties escalating the figure to several $1,000s. Luis explained that the system could be manipulated if someone inside the association filed forged paperwork with enough confidence, and unless Ryan could produce the original deed and bank records quickly, the path toward foreclosure was already being laid. That night, Ryan entered the HOA office again, this time after hours, breaking a small window in the back and slipping inside. He told himself it was desperation, not crime, and that he sought only truth. The office smelled of paper and toner, humming with the low buzz of machines left on. In a filing cabinet, he found the contract stamped with the same development company's logo he had seen on the warehouse boxes, and in one folder his own property address appeared on a list labeled Phase 1 Acquisition. Next to his name, in neat handwriting, was a note. Carson, signature confirmed. Ryan stared at it until the letters blurred, his hands trembling, the taste of iron rising in his mouth. He stuffed the papers into his jacket and fled before the alarm could be tripped, heart pounding as he ran across the empty parking lot. Back home, he spread the stolen pages across the kitchen counter. The evidence was unmistakable. His home had been marked as a target, his name already being erased and replaced with another, his identity gradually pushed out of existence by a machine of bureaucracy that did not care whether he resisted. He thought of calling Luis immediately, but fatigue overtook him, and he collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned, wondering how long before someone came to claim the space beneath his roof. When he finally drifted to sleep, he dreamed of the porch beams breaking again, but this time the sound was not wood splintering but his own bones. The next morning brought confirmation that the process was accelerating. A large envelope arrived by courier, not post, addressed to Edward Carson and current occupant. Inside was a letter announcing an inspection scheduled for the following week to determine whether the property met standards for transfer of ownership. To the development board, Ryan felt his throat tighten as he realized he was already being treated as an intruder in his own house. He drove immediately to Luis's office and threw the letter onto his desk. Luis scanned it, cursed softly, and said that Ryan needed to prepare for open war. Once an entity introduced a second name onto a title, the burden shifted to the original owner to prove fraud, a battle that could take months or years, and during that time the association would push harder with fines, threats, and manufactured violations. Ryan clenched his fists and said he did not have months. The porch was gone, the neighborhood whispered behind curtains, and now his name was being erased from paper. He wanted to hit something, to break something, to make the same sound the workers had made with their sledgehammers, but in reverse, not destruction, but reclamation. Luis warned him to stay calm, to gather more evidence before making any rash move, but Ryan's mind had already shifted. He understood now that he was not simply fighting to rebuild a porch. He was fighting to prevent himself from vanishing legally, administratively, as though he had never existed at all. That night, as he sat in the darkened living room, the rubble still piled outside, he heard a soft rustle at his front door. When he opened it, there was no one there. Only a single sheet of paper slipped beneath the mat. It bore no signature, only a sentence in block letters. "Stop fighting, or you will lose more than wood." Ryan held the paper in the glow of the porch light that no longer illuminated a porch, and for the first time he felt fear not only of losing his home, but of losing himself entirely, swallowed by a scheme that was both ruthless and faceless. The midpoint of his struggle had arrived, and he realized that there could be no turning back. Ryan woke the next morning to the sound of a hammer striking metal, not on his property but somewhere down the block, and when he stepped outside he saw 2 association trucks parked at the corner, men unloading rolls of chain-link fencing as if preparing to divide the neighborhood into parcels of their own design. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, and 1 or 2 stood on their lawns but quickly turned away when Ryan's eyes met theirs. He felt the isolation tighten around him, the invisible quarantine that comes when a community decides someone is marked. On his lawn, the rubble of the porch still sat in uneven piles, though he had begun clearing it, but before he could resume the work, a second envelope appeared, taped crookedly to his door. This one claimed he was in violation for hazardous debris, demanded a fine, and threatened that repeat offenses would justify immediate legal action. The hypocrisy made him laugh, a bitter, hollow laugh that startled even himself, because it was their demolition that had created the debris, and now they punished him for failing to erase their crime fast enough. Determined to confront Mercer again, he drove to the office in the strip mall, But when he entered, he found not Mercer but a younger man in a tailored suit waiting behind the desk, a stranger with smooth hair and a voice too polished to belong to a neighborhood bureaucrat. The man introduced himself as a consultant working with the board and informed Ryan that further discussions with Mrs. Mercer were unnecessary because the matter had moved to the next stage. Ryan asked what that meant, and the man replied without hesitation that Ryan's resistance was only delaying the inevitable transition of the property, that every homeowner needed to recognize the broader vision for the community, and that if Ryan persisted in obstructing, the association was prepared to escalate measures. Ryan demanded to know if escalation meant more destruction, but the consultant only smiled faintly and said, "It means your comfort here will continue to decrease until you make the sensible decision." That night, Ryan discovered what comfort decreasing meant. Returning from the restaurant after midnight, he found his trash cans overturned, the contents spread across the driveway, and a spray-painted phrase across his garage door, "You do not belong." His hands shook as he scrubbed at the paint with solvent, until the skin on his fingers stung raw, and while he worked he felt eyes on him, unseen but certain, as if someone was watching from the shadows to make sure he understood the message. He thought of calling the police, but he remembered the dispatcher's indifferent voice from before and knew the report would go nowhere. Instead, he documented everything, stuffing photographs and notices into a folder that grew thicker each day, though a voice inside him whispered that paper would never outweigh the invisible weight carried by those who already controlled the system. Louise urged him to remain calm, to build the case carefully, but Ryan's patience thinned with every new insult. Within a week, the association sent 2 more letters, one claiming his lawn was overgrown when it was freshly mowed, another asserting that his property line encroached 2 feet into a common walkway that had existed unchallenged for decades. Each notice carried fines, each threatened further action, and each left Ryan more certain that the game was not to correct violations but to bury him under fabricated infractions until he surrendered. He began to notice fewer greetings from neighbors, fewer nods, fewer waves, as if fear of contagion had spread. Speaking to him might make them targets too. He felt himself transforming in their eyes from victim to pariah, and the loneliness pressed heavier than the fines. The breaking point came one evening when he returned home to find his mailbox ripped from the ground and replaced with a bright orange stake bearing a laminated notice. "Foreclosure proceedings pending." He tore it out of the soil, carried it inside, and slammed it onto the kitchen counter, staring at the words until his vision blurred. They had not even gone through proper channels yet, but already they declared him lost. That night he did not sleep, pacing from room to room, staring out windows, every sound of passing cars feeding his suspicion that another truck was coming with men and hammers. He poured himself whiskey, though he rarely drank, sat at the table with the documents spread before him, and whispered aloud that he would not wait to be erased piece by piece. The next morning, instead of going to the restaurant, he drove to the development company's warehouse, the one where he had seen the deliveries. He parked a block away, waited until 2 workers stepped outside for a smoke, and slipped in through a side door left ajar. Inside, the air was thick with dust and paper, stacks of boxes lining the walls, and in the dim light he found maps pinned to corkboards showing the neighborhood sliced into colored parcels labeled Phase 1 and Phase 2. His house, his street, his neighbor's gardens, all were marked with neat red X's. In one folder he discovered lists of projected buyout costs, some names marked settled, others pending. Next to his address was a note scrawled in black ink. Escalate pressure. Subject resistant. He took photographs with shaking hands, then fled before anyone saw him. The certainty of his fears now crystallized into evidence. When he reached home, he spread the photographs across the counter beside the notices and fines, and for the first time he allowed himself to admit the truth he had resisted. This was no misunderstanding, no bureaucratic overreach, but a deliberate, campaigned to drive him out. The porch demolition had been only the opening strike. Now they were inside his mailbox, his driveway, his very name in the county records, and as he stared at the words "subject resistant," he understood that the escalation was not over, that they would continue stripping pieces of his life until nothing remained but rubble. His hands curled into fists, and though Luis's voice echoed in his mind, urging patience and procedure, Ryan felt the line within him shift. He was no longer thinking about defense. He was thinking about what it would take to strike back. Ryan reached the point where the slow grind of notices and veiled threats no longer frightened him, but instead ignited a relentless fury that demanded action. And the decision to move from defense to attack came on a night when he found his car. Windshield shattered in his own driveway with no witnesses, no cameras, and no doubt that it was a message rather than a random act of vandalism. He sat in the driver's seat surrounded by fragments of glass glittering like ice, and instead of despair, he felt a clarity settle over him. They had crossed from intimidation into invasion, and if he continued to wait for legal remedies, he would lose not only his home, but himself. The photographs from the warehouse still lay on his counter, proof of the conspiracy, but he realized evidence meant nothing if no authority was willing to act. What he needed was disruption so complete that the machine itself would break. He spent the next day studying the office of the HOA, watching the comings and goings, noting when the receptionist left, when Mercer arrived, when the so-called consultant in his tailored suit carried in briefcases that never re-emerged. At dusk he returned home, pulled the heavy sledgehammer from his garage, the same tool they had used on his porch, and wrapped its handle with tape for grip. He placed the stolen documents into a waterproof bag and slid it beneath his jacket, because he intended to leave nothing behind but ruin. When night fully fell, he parked a block away and approached the office on foot. The strip mall was nearly deserted, the glow of a laundromat sign flickering at one end and the rest in shadow. He forced the back door with a pry bar, stepped into the silence, and smelled once again the mingling scents of paper, toner, and stale coffee. For a moment he hesitated, not from fear but from the gravity of the step he was about to take. Then he lifted the hammer and swung it with both hands into the wall beside the filing cabinets. The sound was a deep, satisfying crack, plaster breaking apart in chunks, followed by the cascade of frames falling from their hooks. He struck again, this time shattering the glass case that displayed the framed charter of the association, shards scattering across the tile, and in that instant he felt a release of months of suffocated rage. He moved methodically, each blow deliberate, not the frenzy of a man unhinged, but the precision of one dismantling a structure that had claimed authority it never deserved. He smashed through the reception desk, reduced the conference table to splinters, knocked down partitions until the office was a skeleton of exposed studs and dust. Between swings, he pulled open drawers and scattered files across the floor, mixing contracts with financial ledgers, stamping them into dirt with his boots. When he reached Mercer's private office, he paused only long enough to glance at the photographs of her on the wall, smiling with officials and developers, and then he put the hammer through her desk until it collapsed into fragments. The destruction was total but not aimless. Before he left, he placed the stolen documents on top of the rubble where the receptionist's counter had been, weighted by a broken piece of glass, so that when the authorities inevitably arrived they would find not only ruins but proof of why those ruins mattered. He walked out through the front door, leaving it swinging open, and the night air hit him with the sharpness of freedom. Behind him, alarms began to shriek, the system finally catching up to what he had done, but he did not run. He walked calmly across the parking lot, the hammer still in his hand, until he reached his car and drove away. For the first time in months he felt no trembling in his chest, no gnawing uncertainty about what tomorrow would bring. He had torn down their sanctuary just as they had torn down his, and in doing so he had shifted the balance. He did not know whether Mercer would vanish, whether the consultant would call in lawyers, whether the police would come knocking at his door, but he knew the association could no longer operate with impunity. Their office was Rubble, their documents scattered, their secrecy exposed. They had made him into a target. Now he had made them into ruins. The battle had reached its violent crescendo, and in the silence after the alarms he could almost hear the wood of his porch breathing again, waiting to be rebuilt. In the days that followed the destruction of the office, Ryan lived in a strange quiet. Not the calm of safety, but the heavy pause that comes after a storm when the air is still charged with the smell of smoke, and the sky seems uncertain of whether to break open again. He expected police cars to arrive, expected Mercer's voice to thunder from behind legal petitions, yet instead there was silence, and the silence itself became proof that the strike had landed where it hurt most. The neighbors whispered, some crossing the street to avoid him, others giving furtive nods of approval as though afraid to be seen encouraging rebellion. But Ryan no longer sought their recognition. He had destroyed not just walls but an illusion, exposing the association as fragile as plaster once the hammer of truth struck. Within a week, rumors spread that Mercer had resigned suddenly, that the consultant had vanished, that developers were distancing themselves from the neighborhood project, and the office remained boarded up, its windows covered with plywood like a monument to its own failure. Ryan spent his evenings in the yard clearing the rubble of his porch, working slowly, salvaging what he could from the oak beams, his body sore, but his mind steady. When a few neighbors cautiously approached and asked if they could help, he let them, and together they raised new supports, not identical to the old design but strong and honest, built without permission slips or approval stamps. A porch that belonged to no one but him. On the night he drove the final nail, he sat on the new railing with a cup of coffee and felt, for the first time in months, that the ground beneath him was his again. He did not imagine the battle was over, because power never yields forever. But he had carved out proof that resistance was possible, and as he looked at the shadows of his neighbors gathering on their lawns, watching not with fear, but with quiet respect, he understood that the story of one man's porch had become something larger, a reminder that what is built by hand can be defended by hand, and that even in the face of schemes and forged papers and false authority, wood could rise again. From Rubble,